Prime-time speech last night, and his principal thrust, avoiding day-to-day events and scandals and conflicts of interests and allegations of embarrassment. His main thrust was on jobs and economic renewal. Jobs for those who haven't got them, and it would seem no more money for those who are in government employment. Here was what he said on his primetime broadcast last night.
That the top priority must be jobs for the unemployed, not just more money for those already working. In the private sector, collective bargaining continues to lead to realism on both sides of the table. In the public sector, the compensation stabilization program is bringing about the same realism. But like any other program, it can be improved. And the Minister of Finance will be announcing some changes in the CSP in the coming days.
There was ambiguity in what he said, but the reaction from John Shields, the president of the BCGEU, was, as they are in negotiations now, somewhat predictable. Here is what Mr. Shields said last night.
We were deeply shocked to hear in the middle of an election speech the government announced that they were going to make changes to the Compensation Stabilization Act. That act has taken away free collective bargaining in the public sector and given the government extraordinary controls over public sector negotiations. At this point, we have no choice but to suspend negotiations and seek a meeting with the government to try and clarify the direction of the changes that they intend to make in that act.
I'm wondering how, however, Art Kuby, the president of the BC Federation of Labour, feels about the tenor and the thrust of the Premier's speech. Here's what he said.
Well, I'm not sure that these things mean anything. I think what the Premier did last night was wallpaper over BC's major social and economic problems without putting out a single program to put a single person back to work.
Wait a minute, didn't he say that there were 25,000 new jobs that he's created, that there would be jobs for unemployed people instead of raises? And he likes your Australian Accord, isn't that good?
Well, the only good idea which came out of the legislature in the last session was Bob Skelly's proposition that we should form broad consensus and develop an economic plan. Because this government is operating on the basis of crisis from crisis to crisis. There's been a net loss in the last 12 months of jobs in the private sector here in British Columbia.
Tell me, do you think that Labour will go along with Mr. Bennett's call for a deepening and broadening of consensus with Labour?
I mean, he hasn't done anything to move in that particular direction. He has just again taken a very combative position in very ticklish and serious negotiations the government is conducting with the BC Government Employees Union. Look, that guy wants fights, and he wants to start every day a different fight with a different group. People of this province are sick and tired of this government and its combative stance. The only way we're going to have peace, economic recovery, and jobs is when that government goes and we have a new premier in the province.
I will be dealing with the Bennett speech in some detail this morning, but also on the program I have something different. New thinking in the nuclear age. And Bruce Allyn, who is a research associate with the Nuclear Negotiation Project, Harvard Law School. This is something different. An expert in conflict resolution to speak to us this morning too. But first to Victoria, an instant reaction from Bob Skelly to the Bennett speech. Bob, of course, being the leader of the NDP in British Columbia after the break. I myself was quite baffled by Mr. Bennett's no mention at all of any of the conflict of interest or the other crises in the cabinet. But that's his prerogative. He can talk or not talk about what he wants to talk or not talk about. But I want to give you the clip where he gives us a signal that he's not going to talk about the conflicts or the other problems in his cabinet, and also his main thrust on Expo. Here's what Premier Bennett said last night.
I'll not talk about day-to-day events, nor will I focus on any one policy. Rather, I'd like to provide an overview and share some of the thoughts with you on where we can go from here, if we have the will.
So you can see what he avoided. Now let's go to his thrust on Expo, which is going to be the salvation, we all hope anyway, for British Columbia during 1986. Here's what he said.
Expo will be a turning point in BC's fortunes. It will provide massive and welcome economic stimulation, particularly in our tourism and hospitality industry. But its best and most exciting aspect will be its long-term legacy of new investment, new businesses, and new jobs.
Mr. Skelly, not a mention of restraint last night, great talk of economic review, boasting of 25,000 new jobs and more money for health and education. Were you impressed enough to vote social credit if and when the election comes?
No, in fact, I was disappointed and angry when I saw that speech. You're right. The Premier didn't mention restraint. He didn't mention any of the damage that his restraint program has caused. And I think when he was analyzing the economy, he was taking the information from his own taxpayer-financed ads rather than from the real world that most British Columbians are experiencing.
You mean this was half an hour of Partners in Progress?
I think it was a half an hour of taxpayer-financed image building for the Premier, who is one of the lowest in public opinion polls in terms of his performance as a Premier and as a provincial government. He's reached the bottom of the list in Canada.
But he did talk of 25,000 new jobs. He did talk of his $1 billion tax benefits for business and industry in British Columbia. Now, those are real things, surely.
Well, I don't know where he gets his statistics, because there are fewer jobs in British Columbia now than there were in 1981. There's 197,000 people out of work and 235,000 people on welfare. I don't know. Again, as I say, I don't know where the Premier gets his figures, but he certainly doesn't get them from the day-to-day experiences that British Columbians are going through all over this province.
But he's surely giving us exact facts when he says that to encourage business and industry, apart from Expo, there's going to be $1 billion in tax reductions. Are they not already in effect?
Well, he's promised them over a 3-year period, but employment hasn't really benefited that much from the tax concessions he's proposed. It's interesting that the Premier didn't talk about his more spectacular failures. For example, the $240 million write-down of the assets of Quintet Coal, or the fact that brick shares have now gone down to the point where they're considered a speculative penny stock. You know, we're dealing with some spectacular failures in this province, and the Premier doesn't seem to attach very much importance to those. I think that this was simply an effort at image building to try to recover the lost image that his cabinet has.
But will he not get a lot of understanding when he says, in effect, it's the unemployed I'm worried about, and there's not going to be any wage increases, or doesn't seem to be, for those who have jobs. They're going to have to stand pat while he gets jobs for those out of work.
Well, there's no question the Premier is trying to give himself a human side or a human image that seems to have been lacking over the past 4 years. He's implemented a restraint program that's been unbelievably cruel, that's created serious problems for people all over the province, that has put people in fear of losing their jobs and their income, that has plunged thousands of families into poverty, and has thrown the economy of British Columbia off the tracks for a long time. And I believe what the Premier is doing in this program is attempting to give himself a bit of a human side. I think it's all image building.
Didn't you say the other day when the government borrowed $500 million that this $500 million, I think you said, looked like it was going to finance the election campaign, or the election promises, I should say?
Well, I don't recall that, but...
Didn't he borrow $500 million the other day, Mr. Bennett?
Well, he's been issuing new Treasury notes all along for short-term borrowing purposes. Certainly a lot of that was used to finance overruns on the Coquihalla Highway and other highway projects around the province.
But I see he put another $118 million into highway. Is this not a clear indication he's gone back to old W.A.C. Bennett's days of cutting back on homemakers, but financing the highways, blacktop to everywhere?
Well, it certainly puts the lie to what he said on his TV program about concerns for health care and education. At the same time that that information was coming across on television, the other information was coming across was that he was cutting back home care programs to senior citizens. He was forcing them out of their homes and into institutions. And at the same time, he's continued his cutbacks in other government services. So I don't think you can believe or trust what the Premier says on his image-building programs. The day-to-day reality out there is that he is continuing to cut back services to the people of British Columbia, and they're continuing to suffer as a result of his misallocation of priorities.
But do you endorse his obvious go-ahead if and when they can make a contract with California for the billion-dollar Site C dam on the Columbia?
I want to see the contract with California first. Look, if what we're doing is providing cheap electrical energy to California so that they can use that cheap energy as a lure to attract industry away from British Columbia, then I don't think that that project makes very much sense. So I would prefer to see the contract with California first before we pass any judgment on that proposal.
As a political expert looking at his overall speech, do you feel that this moves us closer to an election, or will it be after Expo now?
Well, I think his image has suffered so much over the past few months and suffered so much as a result of the scandals that have rocked his cabinet that I think it's more an attempt at image building. I think if it's successful, we may see some opportunity for an election, but right now his public image is so low and his government is so ridden with scandal and conflict of interest that I don't think there's much chance of an election right now.
Mind you, he made it perfectly clear last night when he said he wasn't going to discuss day-to-day events, that he wasn't going to mention either the ones involving McClelland and Nielsen, or the other ones involving the conflict of interest. Do you think that he would have been a better Premier if he'd faced up to those grave issues on the broadcast last night?
Well, I think he would have indicated more courage, and I think he would have indicated more respect for the parliamentary system and the need for integrity in his cabinet if he had addressed that one head on.
What do you want?
Unfortunately, I think the Premier stands condemned out of his own mouth when he says that scandal and corruption and conflict of interests are day-to-day events in his cabinet. I think that he stands condemned out of his own mouth.
Have you moved your stand at all? Do you think all of these ministers should go?
I think the cabinet is so riddled with conflict of interest. I think that the government is so paralyzed as a result of the conflict of interest scandals that I can't really see any solution to it beyond getting rid of the whole bunch of them. It's impossible to call for the resignations of one cabinet minister after another. In addition, the Premier himself seems to be not beyond the taint of conflict of interest, and I don't think that the Premier is capable of enforcing an appropriate standard of political behavior on his ministers when he is not above the taint of conflict of interest himself.
What do you mean by that, Mr. Skelly?
Well, I'm suggesting to you that the information that recently came out about BRIC shares does not leave the Premier free of the suggestion of conflict of interest.
You mean because he holds some thousands of BRIC shares?
Because he changed the legislation with respect to the holding of BRIC shares in such a way that he himself said that the value of those shares would increase as a result of the change in legislation that he presented to the House. So certainly, he's not above the suggestion of conflict of interest in his own activities.
But is he not protected by the fact that he has said that his assets are in an independent trust position which he does not have control over?
I found it interesting that Ferdinand Marcos said that his assets were also in a blind trust.
Are you suggesting that Mr. Bennett should resign because he holds BRIC shares even in a trust?
I'm suggesting that in that case, the comparison between Mr. Bennett and Ferdinand Marcos is striking.
Well, my thanks to you, Bob Skelly, for your views on last night's prime time, you would call it, image-building speech by Premier Bennett of British Columbia.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Skelly. I think the Marcos reference is a bit of a long bow, but what I want now from you, I'm going to play you a few bits more from the Bennett speech, and I want your reaction. Did that speech give you confidence? Did it make you face this year and the years ahead with ever increased enthusiasm for economic renewal? Or is this province still polarized between the right and the left? Shame though that may be. And I'll be back for your calls after the break. As you know, the Premier last night talked about the Minister starting new consultations for new health funding and talked about extended care beds at Williams Lake, this, that, and the next thing. But he did have something specific, which you can hear now from Premier Bennett, about education in British Columbia.
I met with a number of professional educators and elected officials recently, and I can tell you the Minister of Education will be working closely with all of them to make the best use of the additional funds available for education. You've already indicated where you stand on the issue through our Let's Talk About Schools initiative. But bringing in new programs means we have to keep talking with each other. So in the weeks and months to come, we'll be discussing ways to improve teaching standards and ensure our children acquire the necessary computer skills. We'll evaluate the best way to bring in new laboratory and other equipment, and how to upgrade curriculum and textbooks, retrain workers who have been recently laid off, and improve the quality of language training, including Asian languages, and teaching of English as a second language.
Well, it would certainly seem that there's going to be some new money for education. And while he certainly has the program of Let's Talk About Schools, the Premier did not mention the total collapse of the free enterprise school board candidates after the Vancouver and Cowichan School Board, especially Vancouver, had been wiped out, replaced, and Cope took over every single seat on the school board. That must have told the Premier something. Now we're just going to take reaction on the speech. Go ahead, please.
The behavior of the officers of his cabinet as day-to-day events not worth talking about is unacceptable.
Thank you, sir. That's fair enough. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Jack. My thing is with this speech here is that it is an image-building thing, and I'd like to know more about these jobs. In fact, are these jobs going to be part-time jobs where people are getting the minimum wage and working below the poverty level?
Well, he certainly made the big thrust for the Expo wages, and welcome though Expo is in every way, shape, or form, it does not replace the 20 or 30,000 high-paid jobs we have lost to be replaced by jobs for the period of Expo at something a lot less than the boom era wages in British Columbia. So you make your own interpretation of it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Jack. How are you today? I'm sick of hearing about all these bleeding hearts and these people screaming about poverty and everything. The Bennett government is right on. Look what he's done to just Falls Creek alone. I used to work down there at West Coast Salvage. It's no longer existing. But the pollution down there was unbelievable. That whole place was gutted out. And they've totally created a brand new, people are living there. It's gorgeous. You know, I really don't understand what the problem is with everybody yelling and screaming. Look at the transit system we got going. You know, Calgary can't even afford their own hockey team. I know times are tough right now. You know?
But you're all for social credit. You think he's doing the best he possibly can.
I think he's doing a damn good job. And I'll tell you something. I'm just a cab driver, okay? Mm-hmm. But I see what people think of Vancouver when they come into town. They get in my cab and they say, "This is the most gorgeous city I've ever been in my life."
And it is.
And it is. And we've got it. And we got tourism. We've got a hell of a lot going for us here. And it's time we woke up and started thinking positive instead of negative. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Jack, I think that guy was just just unbelievable, a so-cred from anywhere. I think that Bennett said he's going to recently laid off people. He'll get back to work. I haven't worked for a year and a half. What's going to happen to me?
What did you do for a living?
I'm in the plumbers union, and I'm a welder, so there's no work for me. I'm getting my Class 4 driver's license this week, and I'm gonna go drive cab, and I don't think too many cab drivers believe what that guy just said. Look at Northeast Coal, how much that's cost us. It's for every job they created up there, it's cost us, I don't know, $275,000 or something, or way more than that, I don't know, but I just wanted to say that didn't do any good for me, what Bennett said last night. And Skelly didn't get pushed around by you this time, as he usually does.
Well, it was very difficult to find questions to ask based on the contents of Mr. Bennett's speech.
Oh, definitely it was, but you tried to trap him on that one question about conflict of interest with Bennett, and he referred to Ferdinand Marcos. Now Bennett's going to come out and say, well, look, he's comparing me to Marcos. But I can remember about 8 years ago when Bennett called the NDP the National Socialist Party of Canada, which is the way Bennett does business, huh?
Well, you know, it's a kind of even Steven and tit for tat, and if you
Yeah,
can't...
but Bennett's going to whine for years about that.
Fair enough, thank you. That's his right and his privilege. Go ahead, please.
My view of Bill Bennett's mumbo-jumbo last night, what I could understand of it is that Sins came on a half hour early last night, that's all.
That's not a bad crack. You got to be a television watcher to know what the joke is. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yeah, I think Bennett wins by default when Skelly can make a comparison between Marcus and himself. Then this guy has lost his credibility. He's a yo-yo.
Skelly is a yo-yo. Fair enough. Go into public life and be warmly loved by everyone. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
That's you, sir.
Yes, I have two comments. First of all, I think if I were Bill Bennett, I'd be starting a libel suit against Bob Skelly right away for his remark on Marco, and I'd take him right through the courts in front of everyone. And secondly, I think you as a monitor for your program have set yourself up as an NDP philosopher and supporter. And I think it's about time that you started to give someone else a break instead of knocking everything that the social credit are trying to do. And your comments about McClellan and unfortunately our health minister Nielsen are totally uncalled for. You've been harping on it for so long now that it's about time you found something else.
I have not harped on it. I've said it twice. And if you think Webster must go, that's a perfectly valid opinion. And
you're using your show. You're using your show to purport the NDP philosophy. You had Harcourt on there yesterday and praising him like he was some kind of god.
I did not. I was embarrassing the NDP by pointing out that what Harcourt really wants is Skelly's job, and pointing out that he would probably run in Vancouver Centre. I have been a provocateur for years, sir. I do not espouse the NDP faith or the Liberal faith or the Conservative faith, and I'm not, subject to God's will, going to go. And the management of the station, of course. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack. My only comment is, if you listen closely to that tape last night, you will not know that that's Mr. Bennett's voice. It sounds like it's being pumped out of him because he's a frightened man. Just the whole tape is a frightened Mr. Bennett. Just listen to the tape closely.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just love to see Bennett, and you can see that he's caught in a web of lies and suspicion, and I think you should make it plain, Jack, that it's not a matter of the left and the right, it's a matter of the left and the wrong.
Well, your philosophy shows anyway. Go ahead from Port Alice.
Yes, I think that Mr. Bill Bennett should step back and take a look at all the things that he has said, not only from his own point of view, but from his ministers. Some of the things that he said, he's not quite sure of how he's trying to project between the right and the wrong, and I think that if they're going to call for some of the other ministers to step down, I think Mr. Bill Bennett should take a look at himself. I got wrapped up in something last year concerning the government, whether it's Social Credit Party, it doesn't really matter. I think that perhaps...
I think perhaps you've lost your train of thought. But I think perhaps I should point out that Mr. Bennett's finances are in an independent trust which he does not control. And that, of course, we must all willingly and positively accept, I think. Go ahead after... No, more after the break. Go ahead from Vernon.
Yeah, I'd just like to know how come he can spend so many millions of dollars on showing off Expo to the world when he can be using that for education. And all I have to say, Mr. Webster, is I think Bill Bennett is a joke. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That is a balanced view. You spend money to create something and you bring in a lot of business, you do get tax revenues. But one of the contradictions which upsets a lot of people is that you can spend the next $118 million in highways, but you've got to cut back the homemaker services in Vancouver specifically because they have a higher standard of those services for the sake of a couple of $100,000. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack. I certainly don't see you as an NDP supporter. I appreciate your provocateur role in our social and political structure in BC. I think Bennett was just running scared and gutless. He didn't deal with anything tangible last night. And as far as I'm concerned, the policies and the behavior of the government and their ministers simply is not acceptable anymore in BC. It's not a matter of left, right, Socrat, NDP. All these people that say that if you're against Bennett, you're pro-NDP are forgetting there are other opportunities, there are other alternatives, not just NDP, but the fact is Socrat is no longer acceptable. It's time we had a look at another party and another leader. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And of course, what will be said, as has been said traditionally in British Columbia since 1953, with one short gap between 72 and 75, is that if you dare vote against social credit, you will, in fact, elect the socialists. And that's where the strength is of the NDP in British Columbia, of the social credit is in British Columbia. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I support Mr. Bennett, and I thought he gave a very good speech. I mean, he was just letting everybody know where he was since the last time he spoke. And as far as Bob Skelly goes, he's got a conflict of interest, too, in the whole ideology of the NDP, including Mr. Ed Broadbent. It was in a paper where Bob Skelly claimed kinship and similarity to the Sandinistian regime, and he's got the nerve to compare Bennett with Marcos. I think that these left-wingers better take their rose-colored glasses off.
Thank you, ma'am. Fair enough. Go ahead, please. Hello. That's one. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
That's you.
Yes, I want to know why Bob Skelly has such a big mouth when he didn't even buy $5 worth of brick shares.
Well, he got his 5 free shares as a citizen of British Columbia, I should imagine.
Got them for nothing. He still got them, the cheap bugger.
Mind your language, for goodness sake. Don't need... One thing I don't need is language this morning. Where am I going, Jeanette? Wrong way around. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Jack.
Yep.
I'd just like to make a couple of comments here. First of all, I don't know how many people realize this, but Expo is equivalent to the farm fair. What we have here is a huge parade and big to-do that is all going to be taken down except for a couple of the pavilions after it's all over.
Oh, I think it's a bit more than that. You've got, what, 42 or 48 international... You've got the United States, you've got the United Kingdom, you've got the Soviet Union, you've got China. It is going to be a big international fair. I mean, sure, you can knock it on the carne aspect, but you can't have a fair without carne. Who am I to defend Expo? But it's not like Louisiana or New Orleans.
Oh, no, it's going to be a good show, for sure. But the thing is that it isn't going to be here afterwards.
Oh, no, it's a short-term... project which closes in October. Thanks anyway. Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. What I feel about the people of BC right now, we're just like a bunch of sheep going to the slaughterhouse. The cutbacks are all filled with people doing volunteer work. Men are not making the money they used to make, not making the wages. We're just completely falling apart, and we have to get rid of this smiling figure we have.
Well, that's how you feel provincially, but I mean, with the worst will in the world, you can't blame the whole lumber markets and mining markets on the back of Premier Bennett. You can't blame the economic disasters which we have faced on the West Coast on Bennett. Things are perfectly good in central Canada at the moment, but not here. We're like Washington and Oregon. We're in trouble. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack.
Yes.
Yes, I think Bob Skelly's doing a hell of a good job, and he should be going after Bennett all the time. And after the corruption, what he's got in Parliament there with Rogers and Nielsen.
Don't say corruption. Corruption's overblowing it. It's a conflict of interest. It's a lessening of the standards expected from people in the British parliamentary system. We have a slightly higher standard, I think, than the United States when it comes to it, but the United States deals with it in a much more open way than we do. But corruption is not the word. Please keep your conversation balanced.
Well, Premier Bennett should step down.
Thank you. Go ahead from Revelstoke.
Hello, sir. I listened to Mr. Bennett last night
about all this mumbo jumbo of his. I'd like to know where are all those jobs he said he created. I've been without working for 3 years. I'm losing my house right now, and I don't have any prospect of work yet.
Well, it's not likely you can get a job in the tourist industry. What were you, a tradesman?
Yes.
What kind of tradesman?
Carpenter.
Carpenter. Well, are you prepared to take a $6 cut on your wages and fringe benefits and go back to work under the conditions laid down by the Construction Labor Relations Association?
Well, I'm, yes, if on the supermarket, what it costs now $1 will cost whatever percentage I take less on my wages.
Now, be realistic, though. Don't you think that there is something to be said that the construction unions, along with the employers in boom times, have priced themselves out of today's markets?
In a way, yes, but on the other way, just I would like also the people to realize that we work maybe 4 months out of the year.
But you draw unemployment insurance for the rest of the time?
For 1 year, yes, but then I have to go to welfare.
How long have you been out of work?
Out of work, about 2.5 years.
And you're a union tradesman?
Yes.
And you're 54 years of age?
No, 44.
44, I was 10 years out. What kind of work have you had lately?
Well, lately I haven't done anything.
And you're losing your house?
Yes.
Have a good day. Thank you. I didn't mean that. It's a joke. It's just that the little panic seize upon one. Go ahead from Kelowna.
Jack, it's so easy for people to criticize and pull down someone else who's trying to do something constructive. I don't know that any of the chronic welfare complainers or union complainers or media complainers have given us anything positive or successful pattern for living. So why pull down a man who is an obvious personal success? And where the heck would they expect him to invest his money if not in British Columbia? Can you imagine the brouhaha if he invested out of the province?
I've always taken the position that if the others had followed the example of Mr. Bennett and used the trust system over which he has no control, there is nothing to complain about. But unfortunately, Mr. Bennett did not enforce that discipline on his cabinet. And like it or lump it, Caesar's wife rule does or should apply. More reaction to Premier Bennett's speech after the break. We're taking reaction to Premier Bennett's speech. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Jack.
Yes.
I found it quite interesting to listen to the last lady that called. That was calling from Kelowna, Bennett's hometown.
Fair enough.
I listened to Mr. Bennett last night, and I didn't get too much out of what he said. I work in the healthcare field, and he was talking about 70 cents of our dollar goes to the healthcare. 70 cents of every tax dollar goes to healthcare. Yeah, and you know, I work at Riverview Hospital, and they're talking about closing us down.
No, just a minute. Not 70 cents to health care. 70 cents goes to health and people services care. Now, I've got a bone to pick with you on closing down Riverview, because I think the BCGEU ads were overblown, exaggerated, and caused a lot of panic that should not be on the cards right now.
Well, you know, maybe they're just putting the cart before the horse for a change, you know. But he talked about Expo and light rapid transit and all these things that are going on in the province. You know, I listened to a lady last night on the bus going to work, and she was talking about SkyTrain, and her husband's a bus driver, and she was saying, I said, you should take the SkyTrain home from Vancouver to New Westminster, and she said, well, you know, that's kind of ridiculous because we have trains coming into New Westminster every 4 minutes and buses leaving every 30 minutes from New West. So there's, you know, I mean, I have always voted NDP, Jack. Mm-hmm. And at the end, when they call an election again, when the next year or after Expo, you know, I'm kind of stuck. I don't know who to vote for now, because if we vote NDP and they get elected, they're going to say, well, we're going to have a recession. We're going to have 2 or 3 years to get over the deficit, put a hole in the deficit that the social credit government has left us with, and you know, and then after 3 or 4 years, NDP, everybody's going to be so mad at them that they're going to vote social credit back in. So we're sort of between a rock and a hard place.
Well, that's been the case here since 1953, and it is a shame that there is no alternative any kind without going to one extreme or the other in the first go-round. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, Mr. Bennett should have read page A10 in the Sun last night. Too many people applying for housing for the poor. And perhaps then he would really look at what's happening to the people. And I think Mr. Bennett's a very weak man.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Jack, on Bennett's speech last night, I thought it was just a 30-minute commercial version of all the other propaganda we've seen put out by the Socreds this past year, and I was rather disappointed in the whole thing generally, but as far as Bob Skelly's comment goes, I rather enjoyed it.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, I mean. Wrong sex. Go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm calling from Courtney, NDP country.
Right.
And I have always been an NDP supporter, and probably within the last 8 months to a year, I have decided to switch over to the social credit. I really am tired of the NDP constantly criticizing everything that the Social Credit Party does when they really don't offer any other solutions. Probably the only solution they ever offer are government handouts of some form. If business is not generated in this province, I personally can't see how anything is going to turn around.
Well, thank you, ma'am. Have many of your friends in Courtney decided to switch too?
I know of at least 8 to 10 who are all in the 35-year-old yuppie range, if that's of any influence.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead from Trail.
Hello, Mr. Webster.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know where Bennett is getting his job creations, because there sure aren't any here. We've got a threat over our heads of 200 or 300 more men being laid off, and the way things are going now, we can't afford it.
Well, I must confess, it's very difficult to conceive of 25,000 new jobs when we've got 200,000 unemployed, another couple of 100,000 on welfare, and one consistently sees plants closing down like Bel Air shipyards with 250 jobs lost there too. It's kind of difficult to be visibly optimistic in British Columbia at the moment. Thank you very much. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. I'm, I think, angriest of all about what's happening with the parliamentary tradition in this province. I think it's being savaged. I think that anywhere else, if this was happening, these people would be out. If it was in London, they would be out. If it was even what's happening in Ottawa now with Eric Nielsen, that's such a minor thing compared with all of the conflict of interest going on in BC. Those people shouldn't be in power if they clearly don't know the difference between what is permissible and what's not permissible under the parliamentary system.
Well, the trouble has been that nothing has been laid down by any government here since the late 40s or 50s to make it quite clear. Now, there are those who would say everybody must be pristine and have no stocks or investments in anything in British Columbia. I doubt if that would be acceptable, but I mean, the blind trust properly run, with a registrar saying, in your blind trust, you may hold that, but you may not hold that, would be a perfectly acceptable way to do it. Mr. Bennett has promised some such guidelines, but it's taken them an awful long time to do it. And you know, when Waterland goes and Rogers has the 100,000 shelter units too, you wonder where the difference is.
Exactly. Well, if Waterland is going, why isn't Rogers going, and why isn't Curtis going? It seems to me that it's exactly the same thing in all of those cases, and you can't, well, the old cliche, you can't lock the barn after the horse is left.
But the point is, it's what the people of British Columbia demand, and we're in this unfortunate position where, as the man said, rock in a hard place, one extreme or another.
Yes, well, I think that there is only about 5% between the two parties, and we have an extreme in one direction at this point. And if he wants real consensus, he should try to look at what the other 45% of the people want as well.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Bennett did not mention restraint. What happened to all our restraint programs? From his speech, I understand that he's now going to go out and spend like a drunken sailor in order to try to regain his credibility and to buy our votes. But that's only going to put us into a deeper hole than ever. He should be talking restraint now, because when Expo's over, we're certainly going to have to be practicing restraint in order to keep our heads above water.
Well, he's certainly not practicing restraint on the highway programs, which has been a typical and traditional method to keep people happy and supply jobs. And he said last night, quite obviously, that Site C in the Columbia, which will cost a few $1 billion, will go ahead if and when they get an export deal with the United States. And certainly men in the construction industry, regardless of any other concerns, would be glad to see it go ahead. But the debt in this province, as you know, has gone from $4 billion to about $20 billion since 1975, because with the lumber market and the mining market off, our revenues are way down here. And until we develop them again, if we're ever allowed to, by certain influences, we're going to be in trouble. More after the break. Ed, please.
Hello. I'm a BCGEU member, and responding to last night's speech by Mr. Bennett, I feel that we've already trimmed the fat, and that we're working under severe conditions. We're understaffed, and we've been promised, well, I think we deserve at least a break in how much work and how much productivity we have shown, Mr. Bennett, in that we could be, we could be given at least parity, and if not, be able to keep the benefits that the provincial government used to offer. It just seems to me that we're not going to get anywhere, and it is very hard for me to support my family, 2 children on my own, and to be looking at nothing more. The prices of the jobs are scarce, and I don't want to leave my job.
You're a single parent. Well, Mr. Bennett, one must be reasonably frank, does have a problem. When your lumber royalties and your mining royalties and incomes go down to the bottom of the scale, where does he get the money to do it? He's been borrowing money like mad now, another $500 million the other day, and he can say with some legitimacy that job security, as he said last night, is perhaps more important than jobs increases for those in jobs. And he's talking obviously about public service jobs.
But he's not putting any reasonable grasp on being able to afford anything or support one's family on the present wages that they have, because things are going sky high.
Mr. Bennett says that he can't afford to give any more money. He hasn't got the revenues. Now, it's quite obviously that's going to be supported by a lot of people and opposed by a lot of people.
Well, we all know what the wage freeze is for the BCGEU, and the fact that we're supported by the public or supported by the government or supported anywhere. This is the real life, and I don't see any end in sight. And if the government is going to be supporting me one way or the other, it's either going to be welfare because I can't make it, and the federal government considers me unemployable because I have kids under 12. He's either going to have to see me through this on my butt, or he's going to see me, help me out working for him.
Yeah, but it's unlikely he'll give you an increase. Although the actual CSP announcement last night was ambiguous. We don't know. It may be some slight release on the CSP when we get down to details. But thanks for your call. Go ahead, please.
Morning, Jack.
Morning.
I'd just like to say that I don't agree with the one comment made that you're NDP.
No.
That you're any political party. But there's one question I'd like to ask is why haven't we heard any remarks from Peter Allyn, from the Conservative Party? Like you've put forth that NDP, social credit, and hopefully there was no alternative, or hopefully there would be an alternative. I do look at the Conservative Party as an alternative.
Well, I'm not going to be snide and say who is Peter Allyn, but Peter Allyn's Victoria, and Peter Allyn is a leader of a very minuscule Conservative Party, and he hardly carries much clout in provincial affairs today. If you're a supporter of Allyn, you should go out and work for Allyn and turn it into a party that can field candidates in the provincial election.
Well, I am considering that. I am considering running in the East End. I have been in touch with the Vice President, Mr. Stone.
Well, if you're going to...
Mr. McLean, but I see it as a little bit unfair that you would give the impression on your show that there is no alternative when there clearly is a third alternative.
There is no practical alternative either from the Liberals or the Conservative Party of British Columbia. Face the facts of life. You've got to demonstrate that you're a live, breathing body before you will get the automatic reaction from the press, radio, and television. But best of luck, and if you beat Bob Williams, I'll buy you a fish and chip supper.
Well, it may be suicide for me. It may be suicide, but I'm going to try it, I think, anyway.
Goodbye. That's enough propaganda for the Tories. Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack.
Morning.
I want to, first of all, make clear that I'm a total free enterprise person.
Right.
But halfway through Mr. Bennett's speech last night, I got sick to my stomach and had to turn it off. I disagree with your comment that you can't place squarely on the shoulders of Mr. Bennett the status of this province.
No.
They have been in power for a long, long time. Where is the alternative industry in this province? If we're just putting all our eggs in one basket with mining, with lumber, then of course, if the market goes sour, that's the way the province is going to go. I think they've been in power long enough to make some kind of reasonable changes with regards to manufacturing, with regards to small business. Right here in Richmond, for example, they're building right next to an aquatic center, an older recreation center for older people. And I look out there in the morning as I'm working out, and I see that the lumber that they have there is being imported from Oregon. That's totally ridiculous. How can such a thing happen in a province of where we have so much unemployment? I think it's about time that we made politicians accountable for what's happening with regards to our dollar, with regards to what's happening with unemployment.
Agreed entirely, but go write a thesis about it, because much of our troubles were in the hands of the Liberals and in the Conservative government with its charm and smarm in Ottawa. And if you're going to have free entry of our lumber to the United States, by which we have by far the better end of the stick, you can't stop Oregon producers who can sell in our market from selling up here. You just can't do it. If you're going to put borders around British Columbia and the Americans put borders around on the 49th parallel, we're dead in the water. So face it. Go ahead from Salmon Arm.
Morning, Jack.
Right.
I think Mr. Skelly's doing a fine job, Jack. I'm a 31-year-old tradesman that hasn't worked in over a year, and I see no other alternative right now than to apply for welfare. I think Mr. Bennett should call an election immediately, but I think with all the controversy lately, he's too scared. He'll be kicked out.
Thank you. Take last call. Go ahead from Aldergrove.
Good morning, Jack. I believe, as other callers have phoned in to say, that this province has become too polarized in our convictions. It has divided the people into two sides. I believe that the politicians are getting too personal on their attacks to one another.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother always used to say that if you take care of the little day-to-day things, the big things will always look after themselves. And I don't believe that Mr. Bennett has looked after the little things, because this province is in deep trouble. When you have people that haven't worked for 2 and 3 years as a result of the programs of the government, you have to take a look, I believe, at the government and say, what is happening here? A government is supposed to, I believe, be the most for the people. And I don't believe that this government is for the people. I believe that this government and the politicians are for themselves.
Thank you, ma'am. We'll leave the Bennett speech there for the moment. No election campaign coming up, quite obviously. And I shall be back with my nuclear new type thinkers after the break. Bruce Allyn is a Soviet watcher. He's a specialist in negotiation and Soviet affairs. And you've got some nuclear negotiation project at Harvard Law School. Now, does this make you different from any kind of protagonist for one side or the other?
Yeah, I think that our role is primarily that as a mediator. And we have been having discussions with the Russians for about 2.5 years now. I've been over 3 times this year. And we are discussing these issues, arms control, SDI, Gorbachev's latest proposal, to see what common ground might be found and also how we might improve the negotiation process.
You see, brainwashed as I am by the North American media, I must presume, as a pinhead, that everything suggested by the Soviet Union is an offensive or double-dealing measure against the West, while everything, and I'm pinching this quote, suggested by Reagan or this dreadful man Weinberger or the rest of them, is a holy crusade to save us from the evils of communism. Is that not the North American attitude, by and large, Republican, Democrat, Conservative, and many liberals in Canada?
Well, I would say that the dynamic that we find in U.S.-Soviet relations is not that different than the dynamic we just saw in the debate about Premier Bennett's speech. You find that it's a problem of perception. I was with a Soviet official 3 weeks ago in Moscow, and he commented that the U.S. position is that the Soviets have a 10-to-1 advantage in nuclear weapons in Europe. He then said that he knows a statistician who can prove that there are more people in Ireland than in China, but you count only the redheads. And obviously it depends on what criteria you use to count. And there are differences in perception as to which side actually has the dominance and which side is in the lead.
But how can you people fit into this at any level when you will only be discussing with a few of the Soviet intellectuals now permitted to criticize domestically and perhaps chat you up as propaganda in the conflicts with the States? How can you get to the truth of things in the Soviet Union?
Well, I think that that is perhaps the most striking change. This whole idea of new thinking in the nuclear age has been in Gorbachev's latest speech. There have been publications written about that of late. But I think the most interesting thing is a change in thinking within the Soviet Union, where you find that President Reagan was able to appear directly to the Soviet people, unedited and uneditorialized. The fact that the Soviet position has been, the feeling has been that security lies in concealment. The more people know about you, the less secure you are. We're seeing a change inside the Soviet Union where there's more open debate. I was in a theater in Moscow a few weeks ago where I watched a play about Jewish immigration, a very
touchy subject.
Yeah, it's a very touchy subject, and the issues were dealt with quite openly, remarkably openly by our standards. Also, in the new speech by Gorbachev, you notice that there's an expressed willingness on the Soviet side to allow on-site verification, something which has never been allowed
you
before.
certainly are a new type of negotiator, but explain to me your status and how it came about. I saw a mention here of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, which is also Harvard University, right?
That's right, that's right.
Who backs you in the United States? Is it purely an intellectual backing, free from government pressure, propaganda, or CIA infiltration?
We actually find that perhaps the most productive discussions happen in the private sector. The head of our delegation is a special advisor to Secretary Weinberger, so we have direct channels of influence on the American side and also in the Soviet side as well. We meet with Soviet officials in the Defense Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, as well as academics. So it's not purely scholastic.
But you're not a government agency.
No, we're not a government agency, and in fact that is an asset in many cases because you have the license to explore creative options, where otherwise, given the restrictions of adhering to a governmental position, quite often creative options are missed because there's not the room to explore them.
In other words, you're not on the Helen Caldecott kick at all. You know Helen Caldecott, the great...
Certainly, and certainly.
So do you have an agenda which you deal informally with the Soviet intelligentsia and officials?
Yes, and one of our issues of late that we've directed a good deal of attention to is probably the one area of common ground between the East and West, between the U.S. and Soviet Union. There was an agreement at the last summit to have work done on joint risk reduction centers in Moscow and in Leningrad, where it would be jointly manned by Americans and Soviets. This is actually the only agreement that we've signed in several years. It was largely a result of our project having informal discussions and then the proposal being forwarded to the Soviet government and to the American government.
Joint risk reduction centers.
Right.
What would that be? Just a place where you talk about the joint risk of SDI, for instance?
Well, primarily, there's been a shift in the thinking in the international security community in the last, say, 5 years, whereas previously the greatest threat to each side was perceived from the other one. The greatest threat to the United States was perceived as being the Soviet Union and vice versa. It's now shifting to the point where the greatest threat to each side is seen as being an accidental, inadvertent incident, perhaps in the Middle East, perhaps in Africa. And there's a common interest to collaborate regarding, for example, nuclear terrorism A nuclearized Islamic fundamentalism is a concern that comes up in these discussions. So this would be something like a fire prevention system, which is a step, although one needs ultimately to work on improving the relationship.
Have we got to the stage yet, though, where you can recommend technicians working in the Joint Risk Reduction Centres?
That's being studied right now and will be proposed at the next summit, a plan for this collaborative center, which I think symbolically is of great value because it would be one of the first times that we will have Americans and Soviets working side by side with a common problem.
So therefore Gorbachev is sincere when he says there's a need to move beyond habitual ways of thinking about arms control.
Well, I think certainly that is the case, and I think the exciting thing about that is that there are changes in the ways of thinking inside the Soviet Union. Not only do they not conceal Western positions to their own public now, there's a greater trust to allow the Soviet public interpret, for example, President Reagan on Soviet television, but on the Gorbachev model, they also no longer conceal their wives. Quite a few of the Soviet officials traveling to the West now travel with family.
Moving more to our kind of lifestyles, perhaps.
Well, I think it's a more relaxed and open type of honest contact.
Well, I want you to tell me more, and I want to take calls. This is not a nuclear issue where we're going to be denouncing anyone. Isn't that right?
Certainly
we're not going to say, as Helen Caldicott did, that Reagan is retarded. Is that what she said? Yeah. Interesting. I don't know. Intellectual philosophy for Webster and some of his listeners is a little bit beyond us, but we're going to try calls to Bruce Allyn of the Nuclear Negotiation Project, Harvard Law School, after the break. Well, this is Bruce Allyn, A-L-L-Y-N.
That's
when
right.
did you get into this nuclear positive thinking caper?
Well, let's see, I've been involved and trained as a Sovietologist for about 8 years and making several trips over, studying the internal structure.
Fluent in Russian?
Yes.
That's essential, isn't it? Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yes, good morning, Jack. Good morning, Mr. Allen. One thing he's mentioned, which I think is the big thing, is the opening up of the Soviet Union now. As recently as Andropov, the perception, I think, was that you can't trust the Russians. But now I think Gorbachev is coming across as the more reasonable and saner of the two, and it's President Reagan that people are starting to get a little worried about. So I think it is true that it is a time for a change and that maybe we should trust them a little more.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I would say is that it's a fact in political reality that stereotypes persist long after their relevance. For example, it's often commented that the Soviets are still fighting Hitler and the Americans are still fighting Stalin. And
well, I think it's a new era, such as when Khrushchev first came in and his denunciation of Stalin, and there was a sort of, a new sort of atmosphere. I think that's what's happening now.
Who was the brinksmanship man who terrorized us all? What was his name?
Oh, you mean Khrushchev?
No, brinksmanship. On the brink.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah.
That was Khrushchev.
Yeah, at the end of his tenure, at the beginning,
who?
he was quite a change from Stalin. I think Gorbachev is even more.
I forget his name. The Secretary of State terrified me a lot of my younger life. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, please.
Good morning. Mr. Allen, I'm wondering if the U.S. is willing to go along with the test ban initiative that Gorbachev put forth. And also, it seems to me, I read somewhere that the Soviet Union wanted to use seismic registering devices on that both countries could verify or to make sure that there are no tests.
Mm-hmm. Good question.
Yeah, it is. In fact, that is precisely one of the most tangible changes that is evident in the Soviet position. They are willing to allow not only equipment stationed on their own territory, but for foreigners to come in and to monitor the tests.
So why not?
No reason why not.
Well, I would say that is one of the touchiest political issues right now, because it's simply a fact that the U.S. has in mind making some more tests. And at the moment, the Soviets are ahead in their testing. And in the traditional logic of arms race, it would be seeing oneself as left behind to stop the testing now. When one side is ahead in one area, it wants to ban it. When the other side is ahead, it wants to stop it there, to leave the other at a relative disadvantage.
I'm not sure that I agree with you on that, but it seems to me that's always what we hear, you know, decade after decade, that they're ahead of us. And, you know, how long is this going to go on? It's, you know, somewhere along the line, the testing has to stop.
Yeah, I certainly would agree.
People are dying from economic genocide because of all the money that's being poured into these big corporate military complex that Eisenhower warned of.
Hey, good point. Is there a danger still of the industrial military complex in the United States, or is that not in your purview?
No, well, certainly there are vested interests in continuing the Strategic Defense Initiative, for example. I think the point that I would certainly agree with the caller is that it takes a certain unilateral initiative to break out of any action-reaction cycle, which is the basic dynamic in the arms race. And if we can agree with the Soviets on a few other points, for example, the recent Gorbachev proposal was willing to discount French and British missiles in Europe, and that's a concession on their part. With the concession on the U.S., perhaps in the test ban area, we might be able to move forward.
Good, fascinating. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I'd just like to ask your learned guest if he sees any real possibilities for Canada playing a third party in any kind of negotiation, and if so or if not, if our friendship with the United States economically and socially would prevent that.
Well, I certainly don't think that there's any limitation imposed by the friendship economically, and Canada has played that role in the past, and it is something that we have seen useful results from the Five Continents Initiative, the Contadora Group in South America, and quite often when you have two sides that are highly polarized, they are unable to come to agreement. A third party can achieve a breakthrough. I would mention the Camp David Accord reached in the Middle East was based on a method developed by our project called the one text procedure, where you had Egypt and Israel so highly polarized that rather than set them across from one another at a table and let them knock heads, the U.S. as a mediator went to one side and said, look, what are your interests? What kind of proposal would satisfy your interests? Then took it over to the Israelis, did the same thing, worked out a proposal that ultimately met the interests of both sides, whereas they could not have achieved it in their polarized state.
Well, you can't do that, though, in your particular nuclear negotiation thing, because you've got no middleman there.
Well, I would say that we function actually as a mediator.
As a middleman.
And it's very important in American society because just as in our discussion about the highly polarized combative debate over Premier Bennett's speech last night, the internal backbiting and infighting in American democracy, as in most Western democracies, can be both the greatest strength and the greatest weakness of our country. I was down at the Naval War College in America a while back where we were talking on the theme of negotiating with the Russians. And one admiral said to us, listen, when it comes to my enemy list, the Russians are about number 7. He says, first there's the Pentagon, then there's the State Department, then there's the Congress and the CIA and, the Army. Finally, then there's the Russians. And I think that's a simple fact that in Western democracies, one of the most critical aspects is our internal negotiation, being able to come to some consensus and agreement ourselves before we interface with the Russians.
I'm going to do another segment with Bruce Allyn, New Thinking on the Nuclear Age, after the break. Must mention, though, the exchange with Sharansky, the dissident for the spies. Is that the kind of thing which eases the climate in your nuclear negotiations, or does that not matter?
Well, I think certainly that that greater relaxation of control provides a much better atmosphere for things like recent relaxation in immigration policy.
And person-to-person contact among intellectuals is now freely done without any problem at all.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I would say that there's a marked difference in the degree to which one can engage honestly and openly with Soviet counterparts.
Go ahead from Nanaimo.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I have a book that was written by the Harvard Nuclear Study Group a few years ago. This Arbor Carnes sale, I think.
No, it's Hawks, Doves, and Owls.
Yeah. That's right. It was called Living with Nuclear Weapons.
Oh, that's not it.
Is that anything to do with you, or?
Yes, in fact, that's our project's first book.
Project's first book.
And we've just published a second book called hawks, doves, and owls.
And what's this one?
I heard that, about that one, but I haven't been able to get a copy yet.
Yes.
I also had a book that was out on crisis control centers and that. But you recommend this as a good book, then, I imagine.
Well, certainly in an unbiased fashion.
And here's another one.
Yes, this is our text on negotiation. It's called Getting to Yes, which internationally has sold about 1 million copies.
Would it work for labor negotiations too?
Well, that's the whole idea. We often give talks called Negotiating with the Russians and Your Spouse. And the hope is that...
Okay, thanks, then. I just wondered if it was you guys that put that book.
Good. Negotiating with the Russians and your spouse.
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Jack.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask your guest if he thought that really we're still fighting World War II as far as the Russians go. And basically the nuclear arms race really started with the Berlin blockade.
Well, I would certainly say that, as I mentioned earlier, that stereotypes persist. And in fact, when relations get bad, then those old stereotypes resurface. For example, during the early 80s, when our relations were very tense, the Soviet press was portraying Reagan in Hitlerite fashion. And obviously, those stereotypes are very damaging for relations. I think that certainly thinking is catching up with the times in that regard.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, good morning. I was wondering if your guest has some views about the Gorbachev proposal to reduce nuclear weapons or abolish nuclear weapons by the year 2000. Is that a valid proposal, or is that just a ploy to stop Reagan and his SDI initiatives?
Well, I think it's certainly both, and I think that it should be taken with more than a grain of salt. It shouldn't be taken as the latest propaganda offensive. There are elements in that proposal which are genuinely new as far as the political position. And also, I think that the new spirit that we find in the relationship since the summit has opened possibilities for agreement where there wouldn't have been before. Disarmament proposals are not new. And with increased contact as the basis, then perhaps we can actually make headway with some of these issues.
But if the American press give this kind of thing a fair crack of the whip, I have not seen any emphasis at all on the fact, as you tell me, and I know, that the Russians are willing to have on-site inspection of certain things. They're willing to open areas.
Yeah, I think that any press tends to downplay those elements which threaten its own position. So certainly it hasn't been highlighted, although I would say that President Reagan certainly expressed openness toward the new Gorbachev proposal.
Good. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I was wondering if Gorbachev is serious about his
proposition,
or is it just propaganda?
No, I've answered that already, but briefly from Bruce Allyn.
Well, I think that the benefit of the doubt certainly should be given because there are constructive changes in the proposal.
I'm going to give you a phone number in a couple of minutes about information on Bruce, and I'll tell you what speeches he's making in town, so have a pencil handy. I don't think we've got it up in the... Maybe we've got it up in the card. Go ahead from Powell River.
Morning, Mr. Webster and Mr. Allyn. I would like to make two brief statements and ask one favor of Mr. Webster. The first statement being, I think right now the proliferation of atomic weapons or nuclear weapons is so great that it would be almost impossible to eliminate them entirely. And the greatest threat we have right now is, as Mr. Allyn said, terrorists utilizing a nuclear weapon. We have them now that they can pack them on their backs. The second statement, I kind of think the nuclear deterrent is probably the greatest thing we have going for world peace. I'm afraid with the coming economic crunch that Joe Granville predicts, that our side particularly, if we come to a nuclear arms agreement, like where we're not going to use nuclear arms, that we'll be in the midst of a conventional weapon just to get our conventional weapons war.
Okay, what's
our
the favor?
economy's going.
I'm running out. What's the favor you want?
The favor, Mr. Webster, is to ask you to please refer to those houses as bordellos and not use the word that you have been using. Thanks a lot.
That was kind of off the topic. Now, you're speaking tonight in the lecture hall number 2 at the Woodward Building at UBC. That's Thursday. Is this Thursday?
Yes, it's tonight.
8 p.m., lecture hall 2, Woodward Building. Saturday, you're having a workshop at the International House at UBC. And we'll put the number up there before, 266-0513. And then you've got a date at UVic when?
University of Victoria will be tomorrow night, Friday night,
Friday
And there will
night.
be a workshop in Victoria on Sunday as well.
Okay, so you've got 4 things going on. And the number we gave you is 266-0513 for the information. Time for the last call. Go ahead, please. Hello. You hung up on me. Did you? Yes, you did. How cheeky of you. Go ahead, please. Hello.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
I'm calling from Victoria.
Carry on.
Yeah, my grandfather used to say that you can't turn your back on the Russian bear. I don't think things have changed in the last 50 to 70 years.
Fair enough. Now, how's that an example of a stereotype?
Well, I would say that when there is fear toward another person or another country, one tends to take the worst case analysis. And I think that the more you know about the Soviet Union, the less afraid you are of it. There's a joke that circulates inside the Soviet Union that goes like this, that the Soviet Union is the only country in the world surrounded by hostile communist countries.
Fair enough. I must cut your joke there because this has been Bruce Allyn, Research Associate, Nuclear Negotiation Project, Harvard Law School. I'll be back after the break.
Expo.
Couple of things booked for tomorrow. We've got Eric Buckley, I think, of the BC School Trustees Association. Then we're going to do a piece on real estate, residential, with a big noise from the east, who knows all the country's problems. Might have a surprise or two for you, too. Anywho, I'll be here tomorrow at 9 a.m. Almost forgot the time precisely.
Expo 86. 85 days to go.